Welcome to this webinar, everyone, hosted by the 21st Century China Center at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. GPS is a top-ranked professional school devoted to the study of international affairs, economics, and public policy. We offer PhD, master's, and bachelor's programs, and one of which, with a China focus, is the Master of Chinese Economic and Political Affairs, or MCEPA. If you're interested in this program, you can find out more information at https://gps.ucsd.edu. I'm Micah Muscolino, professor and Paul G. Pickowicz Endowed Chair in Modern Chinese History here at UC San Diego. Thank you so much for joining our discussion today. This webinar is recorded and will be available on our website, china.ucsd.edu. Please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. I'll be reading the questions you submit for our speaker during the Q&A time at the end of the presentation. So today we are delighted to have a truly outstanding scholar speaking for us today, Professor Li Zhang. Li Zhang is the author of two award-winning books, Strangers in the City, which came out with Stanford University Press in 2001, and In Search of Paradise, which came out with Cornell in 2010, and a new book, Anxious China, Inner Revolution and Politics of Psychotherapy, which came out with the University of California Press in 2020. She is also a co-editor of Privatizing China, Socialism Afar, published by Cornell University Press in 2008, and Can Science and Technology Save China, also published by Cornell in 2020. Broadly speaking, her research concerns social, political, spatial, and psychological repercussions of the market reform and socialist transformations in contemporary China. And she really is one of, if not the foremost scholars researching those topics in the field of anthropology. She was a 2008 John Simon Guggenheim Fellow, which I think speaks to her qualifications, and the president of the Society of East Asian Anthropology from 2013 to 2015. She has also served as interim dean of the Division of Social Sciences from 2015 to 2017, and chair of the Anthropology Department from 2011 to 2015 at our sister school, UC Davis. So after Professor Zhang's presentation, I'll start a conversation and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So please, everybody, welcome Professor Li Zhang.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Micah, for your very generous introduction. And also, I want to thank the center for inviting me and hosting this event. Let me turn to a screen sharing here. Do have a PPT here. Okay, so I assume you can hear me okay. Okay. So my talk today is intended to give an overview of my recently published book, Anxious China, Inner Revolution and the Politics of Psychotherapy, published by UC Press. I first want to share an image of the book cover. This is an artwork done by Zhang, a very talented Chinese artist. It's called The Braid Field. I feel it really captures the mood of anxiety I want to convey in this book. And towards the end of the talk, I also hope to take a closer look at one specific issue regarding the rise of a therapeutic self, to give you guys a sense of how I, as an anthropologist, approach psychotherapy through ethnographic fieldwork. So China's economic reform has brought about profound ruptures in not only social economic structures, but also people's inner landscape. The Center for Mental Health estimated that over 100 million Chinese suffer from different kinds of mental illness today. Faced with relentless market competition, rapid social change, and the pressure to become successful, many Chinese people are feeling unsettled and distressed. Some of them are turning to professional psychological counseling to grapple with their anguish and problems in hope for a quick fix. In this context, a new therapeutic language of self-care and self-mastery, along with a medicalized language of managing anxiety, depression, and stress, is entering Chinese society. As a reporter once put it, quote, "This is a radical shift in a nation where focus on the individual was discouraged by both socialist ideology and traditional culture," unquote. My book is an ethnographic account of how this new inner revolution is unfolding in urban China. As my research shows, this bottom-up popular psychological movement is reconfiguring the self, the family, social relationships, and the modes of governing in China. So I call this phenomena the inner revolution, 内心的革命, to highlight its transformative impact on so many aspects of life, even though this is still in the early stage of development. Unlike many other revolutions you have heard, the Cultural Revolution, the Consumer Revolution, and so on, this inner revolution is relatively quiet, but it engenders profound changes from within. It's spreading rapidly, and its impact goes far beyond the individual realm and the clinical space. Schools, enterprises, the police, and the military are increasingly keen to incorporate the psychological techniques into their personnel management when these organizations are also facing multiple challenges today. So psychological counseling in China is not limited to the reshaping of the individual and the family domains, but also extends into governmental practices and the broader social domains. I think this is the point I really want to highlight in this book. Inner revolution, as I demonstrate, is simultaneously personal and political, intimate and social, subtle yet powerful. For this reason, when I did my research and wrote this book, my ethnographic gaze travels from clinical space to other broad social domains, such as the family, school, and workplace. So it's not limited in any clinical setting. Now, let me first say a few words about the context for my research, and just to give you guys some background information. Since the early 1990s, a Psy fever, 心理热, has been sweeping Chinese cities. It includes a broad range of activities, from the teaching and the learning of psychology to group and individual counseling, from self-help and cultivating happiness workshops to mental health concerns. So it's a broad range of terrain. Numerous books and magazines on mental health and psychology have been published. This is a magazine, popular magazine on psychology in China. There is a burgeoning regime of private counseling centers, training workshops, and the websites on psychological well-being. So the newly certified counselors. International experts are invited to lecture to large crowds of Chinese who are eager to learn how to escape emotional pain and attain the good life. So I don't have time to go into these slides. I just want to provide some of the visuals for you to see that this is a big phenomenon in China. While most of these efforts are directed at middle-class urbanites, some marginalized social groups such as laid-off workers and migrants are also subject to therapeutic intervention imposed by the government. For the middle class, it's more a bottom-up. This therapeutic turn forms a stark contrast to the time under Maoist regime when psychology and psychiatry were largely non-existent and considered a useless and harmful bourgeois invention. So I have a chapter in my book tracing the early emergence and the later development of psychology in China, if you're interested. So how do we explain this significant shift in the way people manage their well-being, endure distress, and recast selfhood when family bonds and social ties become increasingly fragile today? And how can it be that this popular Psy fever has taken hold in China at this historical moment? So in this book, I explore the causes, logics, and ramifications of this expanding therapeutic culture. You notice my book is titled Anxious China, right? Because I argue that among various forms of mood disorders, anxiety, 焦虑, broadly construed in both social and medical terms, has become a key indicator for the pulse of contemporary Chinese society. And over the past 2 decades, it has come to my attention that Chinese people of diverse social strata are experiencing not only medically defined anxiety, but also widespread social anxiety for a variety of reasons. And nowadays, given the pandemic of COVID, this situation is even more serious. This edginess is particularly palpable in China today because this society has been undergoing 4 decades of profound structural and cultural transformations. Before I turn to the main themes of my book, let me tell you a little bit about my fieldwork and the personal experience that inspired me to write this book. As an anthropologist, fieldwork, ethnographic encounter is essential. So from 2010 to 2018, I conducted extensive ethnographic research in the city of Kunming, the capital of Yunnan province. This city has evolved from a relatively poor borderland city into a regional hub of tourism, commerce, and international trade. And by the way, it's also my hometown where I grew up and did extensive research for my previous book on middle-class housing and city planning. So during my fieldwork, I was able to sit in a dozen private counseling sessions, either individual or family. And also I participated in numerous psychotherapy training workshops. And I also followed several Chinese therapists for many years who later became my key informants. So these are the basis where I drew my data. If you have a chance to read my book, you will also see that this is a deeply personal project for me. I have tried to incorporate my own encounter with anxiety attacks a few years ago after the passing of my mom, and also my family's experience, particularly my late mother's experience concerning depression and anxiety, and also some of the stories of my close friends in China. So this is a very personal project for me. These lived experiences opened a rare opportunity for me to connect with my informants deeply and understand their emotional pain in a much deeper and intimate way. So now let me turn to outline the 3 central issues of my book. So I'll go through them here one by one. The first concerns the role of culture in therapeutic encounter. Psychotherapy took hold and spread in China so quickly, largely because it's seen as a potential answer to the myriad social and personal problems facing the society today. So a key step to make imported psychotherapy work is through this process called 本土化. 本土化, namely, Psy practitioners must strive to make globally circulated psychotherapy comprehensible for their Chinese clients and suitable for their social and cultural sensibilities. This is a very important process. 本土化 is not just an intellectual project, but part and parcel of the effort to tackle a host of very difficult issues facing Chinese individuals, families, and organizations. And this is, in the book, I argue, a complex dialogic process during which Chinese practitioners select, rework, and make sense of diverse therapeutic practices. So I show why among many available branches of psychotherapy, Chinese practitioners embrace and modify 3 of them, at least in the place I did my field work. So these 3 are the Satir family therapy model, cognitive behavior therapy, and Jungian-inspired Sandplay therapy. So these are the 3 most important approaches Chinese therapists embraced. Let me give you one example about this 本土化 culturing process. For example, the core of the popular Satir family therapy is to situate what appears to be the individual's problem into the larger family system, rather than isolating their problems and solely focusing on a single individual. A few slides here. This is the Satir, who invented the model, her books. Almost all of them have been translated into Chinese, and they are popular books in China. Okay. So the therapist I spoke to suggests that the strong preference for this family-oriented therapy is shaped by a long-standing Chinese cultural expectation of the self as a social self, and also one strong obligation to his or her home family, and the collective-oriented ethics. So my research shows that while the Satir family therapy resonates really well with how most Chinese people think about their role, the role of family in shaping a person. In practice, however, it's not always easy to secure family participation due to time pressure, financial limits, and the gendered understanding of parental roles and emotional care in the family. So this is a very complicated domain as well. Another example of 本土化 culturing process is to connect between cognitive behavior therapy and a long-standing socialist practice known as thought work. For those of you who study China, you would have heard of that, 思想工作. The gist of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is to use psychosocial intervention to help clients develop better coping strategies by modifying their behavior or dysfunctional thinking. Although the content and the aim of thought work differ greatly from those of CBT treatment, one can identify some interesting parallels between the 2. 3 therapists I interviewed brought this to my attention first because they all had been in the profession of doing thought work at universities or state enterprises before turning into psychotherapy. It was very interesting. They found the CBT a good fit with the way Chinese people think about the relationship between thought and behavioral change. So even though their focus in CBT work is not a political ideology or political persuasion anymore, but rather on promoting personal growth and tackling emotional problems and family problems, the communication skills they had learned from previous thought work can be applied to talk therapy easily. So this is a very interesting and a surprising finding for my book. The second theme, going back here, the second theme I explore in this book is about therapeutic governing. Some researchers have argued that modern welfare states tend to normalize the marginalized social groups by subjecting them to the help of health experts and social workers. So the basic assumption is that these people cannot govern their own lives or adjust to the demand of increasingly stressful everyday life. Therefore, they need expert help. Psychiatrist Thomas Zass depicted an even more dystopic image of the therapeutic state encroaching deeply into civic life, including the health and the soul of the people. But I instead want to adopt a bit more nuanced approach here. So I use the notion therapeutic governing to reveal how psychiatric and psychological interventions are used by both state and non-state authorities to shape, regulate, and manage the conduct of individuals and social groups in a much subtle way that people are actually willing to embrace. For example, under recent political regimes, a preferred style of governing is through the notion 关爱, loving care, rather than through domination and the political control. So one of the ways in which kindly care, 关爱, kindly care is practiced is by integrating psychological care and education into personnel management for many organizations, including the police and the military and school. Their goal is to create a more resilient, stable, and efficient subjects. Here's this slides of a police training camp utilizing psychological techniques in their training. One of the cases I present in the book is a paramilitary hospital in Kunming that used psychological testing to screen new soldiers and establish psychological records. 档案. Soldiers are also offered counseling and positive psychology training to enhance their psychological resilience so that they can handle stress and disaster relief work better. The incorporation of therapeutic techniques into organizational life in the name of care is transforming how governing is carried out and how citizens are shaped and managed from inside out. And I think this is relatively new in China. But the reality is more complicated. These therapists are usually also party members in the military and the police, so they have to negotiate their dual role to fulfill their political loyalty to the party leaders above and to protect their clients, soldiers' privacy. So it's a difficult task. Just a couple of slides about using the satire model for training enterprise workers, state enterprise workers, positive psychology for state-owned enterprises. The third theme in this book is the emergence of a therapeutic self, a mode of self created with the aid of psychotherapeutic engagement, either through private counseling or group training like this, right? So I ask here, why is the self granted extraordinary salience among middle class today? What specific projects of self-development and self-care are emerging? So the question of selfhood and self-cultivation has a long genealogy in China For those of you who study Chinese history and the literature, you should know better than me. In the book, I trace some important continuities and discontinuities from the dawn of the 20th century to Maoist socialism and to the post-Mao period. So what I want to point out is that unlike the past, self-cultivation today has become a technical matter involving psychological experts' intervention. So my analysis of the self here is very much influenced by Michel Foucault's notion of technologies of the self, which refers to practices that seek to transform oneself through a number of operations on their own body, thoughts, and conduct. But I also want to argue that such technologies are very much historically and culturally conditioned. So I want to show that the self, 自我, is not a pre-given, right? Instead, it's formed through this constant social recognition and negotiation with the broader social obligations and the cultural norms. And in China, the making of the self is further complicated by multiple coexisting expectations and ethics. You can name them as traditional, socialist, and neoliberal, right? Over the past 2 decades, this socially embedded self has been undergoing profound transformations, as many scholars have shown, like Yun Jianye at UCLA. Yet it's still very much entangled with one's social obligation, socialist ethics, and the prevailing cultural values. So my ethnographic account unravels this constant articulation of the self and the social in therapeutic encounters. So here, let me just give you a quick concrete example of how this dual process, I call them disentangling and re-embedding, works in the self-work through therapeutics. At a Sandplay therapy training workshop, I met Feng Gang, a distressed 35-year-old police officer. So we met at one of these training workshops, who was suffering from growing tension between him and his supervisor and family. We later became good friends because we shared a special moment when I was assigned as his therapist in a simulated Sandplay training session. I myself went through some of this training. The arrangement here, the arrangement he created was very telling. It was a desert scene with a red snake that appeared to be stranded in the sand. Nearby, there is a green cluster of a cacti and a jade horn. So when we sat down, I asked him carefully, does this scene speak to your situation? He nodded and tears came rolling down. He said, this snake is just like me. I never had a chance to look at myself like this before. And then he went on, I feel that the snake is very lonely and stuck. I'm trying to move forward towards the green plants, perhaps an oasis in the desert, but the snake is very tired and will probably never get there, unquote. So I later learned that Feng Gang was a plainclothes police officer responsible for catching pocket pickers in city buses. So his work was highly demanding and dangerous, but his supervisor did not trust him and accused him of slacking off. At home front, things were also very difficult. He and his wife just had a newborn, so he needed to spend also a lot of time trying to take care of this newborn. And his parents-in-law who lived with them questioned why a policeman like him would want to study counseling and thought it was a total waste of time. So Feng Gang looked very depressed when I met him, but he never went to see a psychiatrist because mental illness was highly stigmatizing in China. And also he thought he could just toughen up, as many people do. Yet he was slipping into deeper isolation and sadness. He cherished these moments of a training session that gave him a safe space to look deeper into his own psyche. So Fong later told me, he offered me his reflection on this dual process of self-work. Quote, he said, 自我, self, has two layers of meaning. One is the self that's living here and now, which is deeply embedded in the family, kinship, and society. The other, the more pristine self, removed from the reality, which can emerge only from time to time, he said, when I'm in meditation or doing therapeutic work. I am longing for the disentangled self, but I cannot abandon the socially embedded self because both together make me human, unquote. So here, disentangling refers to detaching oneself temporarily from one's family in the workplace and the social nexus, right, through therapeutic work. And re-embedding is the subsequent return to the social nexus after therapeutic work. So these two they go together in this therapeutic work. So let me give just a few final remarks before we can turn to the Q&A and some discussions. So throughout my research, I have been very ambivalent towards the rise of psych fever in China. Why? Because on the one hand, there is a risk to psychologize a host of socioeconomic problems that are derived from and demand structure changes. So there's a risk of, turning our eyes away from those issues. Psychotherapy in that case can be used as a political tool by directing our attention away from the structural issues towards only individual psyche. But on the other hand, psychological intervention also provides some relief and hope to those people struggling with emotional torments and longing to live a better life. Therefore, I feel that it's important to treat this therapeutic turn seriously by discerning its promises and shortfalls, claims and unintended consequences. We can't simply just discard it as some kind of false consciousness, right? Finally, anxiety, if anxiety can be seen as a general symptom of a society in distress, the aim of my book is to offer a glimpse of how ordinary people, individuals and families and organizations in China today grapple with this condition during this massive societal transformation. So I'm going to end my talk here. Once again, thank you for coming and thank you for listening. And I really look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Professor Zhang, for that really fascinating talk. There are a number of things that I'd like to ask about, but I don't want to monopolize the time as the host. So I'm just going to ask about one of them and then shift the focus to questions from the audience, which is quite sizable today. In that vein, I would like to remind those in attendance to post any questions to the question and answer box, and I will relay them to Professor Zhang on your behalf. So the topic that I wanted to talk about relates to psychology in rural China, because I know and I fully appreciate that your ethnographic site was in Kunming, and you have rightly stressed the importance of middle-class urbanites in your discussion. But in recent years, I've been doing research in rural China, and in driving around, I was actually struck by billboards publicizing psychology clinics in rural villages. And so given that urban society and rural society have some significant contrasts between them, I was wondering how those contrasts fit into your emphasis on the self and the social in these kinds of therapeutic encounters. Maybe this isn't a topic that you encountered in your ethnographic research, but I'm just curious to know if you have any thoughts about it.
Thank you, yeah, Micah, for that question. Yeah, certainly very interesting. So as you noted that my research largely focused on the urban middle class. So as a result, I didn't do research in the rural area. Nevertheless, I read a few other people's work, and I can offer some thoughts there. So my sense is that in rural China, psychological counseling and psychology have begun to kind of trickle down there in more recent years, certainly behind the urban area, right? So partially, it's also very costly. This is a very costly business in China today. So just to give you a sense, for a psychological counseling session, private session in Kunming is not even Shanghai and Beijing, the cost doubles there. So even in Kunming today, the rough cost is about 300 to 500 yuan per hour. And that's very expensive for ordinary people. Most people cannot afford it. That's why, urban middle class and professionals, they can, but they can't afford long-term either, right? So they would hope to come for a couple of sessions and just leave. So in the rural areas, I can imagine the situation would be even worse. But that doesn't mean that there is no mental issues in the rural area, of course, and I think it's very serious. So one of the very interesting books is by Wu Fei, who graduated from Harvard, and he wrote a book on suicide in the countryside. However, in that book, I think he argues that in the countryside, it's not so much a mental health, it's not seen as a mental health issue, suicide, mostly among women. It was seen more as a moral protest. Yeah, when these women encounter the issues, family issues, and it's a moral protest. So I would love to see more people doing research in the rural area, because I believe it's a very important topic for them as well. Some people like Jie Yang from Canada, Simon Fraser, she has done research among the more marginalized groups in China, laid-off workers and migrants. So, I really hope more researchers would pay attention to this. Yeah, so from the urban middle class, privileged class, to the less privileged, to the rural area. But thank you. Yeah, but it's interesting to know that you see all these signs. That's
not frequently, but they are around. Out in the middle of the field, there will be a billboard that says psychological clinic or psychiatric clinic. And I was always just very curious about what demographic those clinics catered to, and whether they were primarily for crisis management or if they were services that people sought out, but that cost is potentially prohibitive. Like that's equivalent to what, like $40 or $50 an hour, which is a real significant outlay for somebody even in rural areas. That's not a small sum of money.
Right. And also, I guess it depends on which rural areas. So, some areas like Zhejiang, Wenzhou, they are more well off. So maybe they are able to afford it, while inland China, Southwest, that's just a number they can't even think about.
Yeah, these were areas in Shanxi and Gansu, so they're not particularly well off. Yes.
That's right.
But we could talk about that at great length, but what I'd like to do now is turn the floor over to people in the audience. And so we have a question from Harris Doche, who asks, do pushes for familial therapeutical practices come from individuals experiencing mental health duress, from the families, or from both? Where does resistance come from in your experience? And he'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
So about the family therapy, the push for that, Mostly, it's interesting in China. The push actually originally comes from the therapist, because oftentimes the therapist is quite aware after studying all these theories and all the stuff. They know that the so-called individual's problems are never individual, right? It's usually derived from the family system. And this is a particular case in China when the emphasis on family is very strong. So usually the therapist would push for that, right? For example, a mom might bring a child, a son, into therapy, and then very quickly, setting some of those therapy sessions, very quickly became very clear that it was a really highly problematic parental-child relationship and dynamic, and they have to bring parents into this therapy, right? So usually it's in that context. But then the resistance, the person who is seeking counseling usually is willing, because they're suffering, they're dealing with a lot of issues. So they're willing to bring in family members, either spouses or parents. But a lot of time I notice that parents are not very willing, especially fathers. So in the book, I write about this gendered expectation and gendered practice. A lot of time fathers would say, no, I don't have time. I'm the primary breadwinner. I'm very busy. I don't have time. I will pay. Mom will go. I don't need to go. And also there's this gendered expectation of emotional care, emotional work in a family. It's done by women, by mom. So the father usually is very reluctant to participate, to open up, sometimes involves crying, they're not willing. So there is definitely a very gendered resistance there. I noticed, yeah.
Fantastic. So I just wanted to quickly remind everybody to put questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat. It just makes it a little bit easier to keep track of them, although I will get to the ones in the chat box as well. So this is a question from Dorothea Leicher, who asks whether you're familiar with the work of biologist Sapolsky and the economist Stiglitz, who talk about how the stress of social marginalization, including economic exploitation, lead to mental health symptoms.
No, yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I'm not very familiar with this work. So yeah, I would love to follow up if it's in the Q&A or chat later on. Maybe I can write down the name, but thank you. No, not very familiar. Yeah.
Okay, so we also have a question from Lei Guang of the 21st Century China Center here at UCSD. And he'd like to know, how is what you're describing related to the changing family dynamics in society, including the rise of one-child households? Besides the rural population, did you compare different urban populations, as migrants whom you've studied in the past and permanent city residents?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Yeah, this is a big question, but it's a very good one, because certainly I think the phenomenon we're describing here is very much related to the changing family dynamic as a result of the one child per family policy. After 2 or 3 decades, 3 decades at least of that policy. Now the generation we see, most of the young kids, school-age kids, they are singletons, 小皇帝, single child. So a large portion of people who come to seek counseling actually are those kids and brought by their parents. So there are a couple of layers here. One is that they are the single child in the family, so they are under tremendous pressure to perform for the family, not just for themselves. They are all expected to be number 1 or at least top 10 in their class, but we know what about the top 90 who are not top 10, right? So they're under a lot of pressure. When they don't perform very well at school, parents usually think something's wrong. And something is wrong. They think they have psychological issues. And that's also true, they do have under all those pressures. There's some kind of survey done in China. Basically, school age kids, a lot of them are depressed, and there's a high percentage of high school kids also have suicidal thoughts, right? So it's all because they're under so much pressure. And also, you all know the Chinese educational college entrance system, very, very stressful. So many of the clients are young children brought by their family in to try to solve the problem. So parents, of course, nowadays think, well, if I'm willing to pay the money, maybe these experts can give me a quick fix. So I'll come in once, twice, just diagnose my child. They treat mental health as other kind of medical illness. They are hoping to get a diagnosis, and then this person will write a recipe, say, do this, do that, all right? And they will get better, but we all know it's not the case. So there's also this mismatch of expectation and what the therapist can do. And that also affects the treatments, because a lot of time therapists would like them to come back at least 3 times or 5 times. Most of them would disappear after first time or second time. Either they can't afford, or they just don't believe this kind of a long-term, drag-long treatment as we do in the West here, right? We go for years. We go once a week and we go for years, but that's not the norm in China. Right? So it's related to this changing family system. And about, I think your second part of the question about migrant workers, and again, that's the part I think I didn't do much research. So that's in the realm of Jie Yang, my colleague from Canada. I think she wrote a little bit more about those workers who are facing different kinds of stress and I think issues than the urban middle class and these kids. Right? For them, it's more the survivor and the liminal state they are in the city. So it's a different kind of stress they are facing. Yeah. I hope I answered some of your questions. Thank you. Yeah.
Right. So I'd like to ask another question on behalf of Artemis Liu, who is a psychodynamic therapist and is curious why Professor Zhang didn't include a psychodynamic approach, which is, according to Artemis, a very popular one in China. And yeah, that essentially is the gist of the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure about when you say it's very popular in China. I'm pretty sure some areas, some cities, like I think in Shanghai, there was a group, 精神分析, like a psychodynamic group. In Beijing, maybe. The place where I did my research in Kunming, I really encountered that. So I kind of, as an anthropologist, I followed the people I studied to see what was popular among them, what they do, and I try to engage with that. So it does not mean that it's not there. It could be there. I maybe did not follow or find that, but in other cities, it might be also popular. But in the place that Kunming, the city where I did my research, that was certainly not the most popular, most widely practiced, but instead it's the 3 I mentioned. I attended so many of those training sessions. So it's the Satir family systematic and the CBT, cognitive behavior, and the Yongnans by the Sandplay. Sandplay therapy is so popular in China. Every therapist's office you walk in, there's a sandbox there. This is not the case in the US either here. It's very rare. I mean, I saw once, and it's mostly because that psychotherapist was working with kids. So, but thank you for your question. I imagine it might be popular elsewhere in other parts of China, but yeah, not where I did my research. Also, one can only do so much. So when I found that the 3 are most popular, I try to focus more on them instead of spreading the energy onto also many practices. Yeah.
Great. So we have a question that is appropriately asked by an anonymous attendee about confidentiality in a therapeutic setting, and whether that is a principle that is valued as an important element of the therapeutic relationship in China?
Yes, confidentiality and privacy are very much emphasized in China as well. I think all the newly trained psychotherapists, they are aware of that. That's the most cardinal first principle, is to protect the privacy of their clients. So it is, and that also became a problem, right? So when I first wrote my National Science Foundation grant, I got a 3-year grant. The original intention was to sit in lots of those sessions to see the dynamics between the therapists and the clients. But it became very clear when I went back to China, it was very difficult. So I was lucky enough to be able to sit in about 12 to 15 sessions. And it took a lot of effort to get the permission from the clients, and mostly the sessions I sat in, most of them are family therapy, like it involves parents and children or a whole family there. Individual ones I was able to sit in 2 or 3, only individual one, and they are great. They gave a lot of trust to me, but not very easy. So, and we really respect that. So when the client says no, we don't push. Yeah.
Fantastic. There are actually many excellent questions, and due to time constraints, I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them, but I wanted to go back to Sandplay. Charles too asked how that works, because as you said, it's not something that's terribly common in the US apart from child therapy. So could you describe that a little bit?
Yeah. Wonderful question, because I want to comment on that. Sandplay is so popular in China. I wrote a separate article that's published later after this book. I talk about how important it is for Chinese people to engage in somatic healing. That means a lot of time, I can't say all the Chinese, but a lot of Chinese people, they are not satisfied with just talk therapy, sitting on the couch talking based on narratives and words. They want to mobilize their senses, body, somatics, to engage in psychotherapy, and the Chinese psychotherapists are aware of that. So I think this is one of the ways to mobilize people's body, your hands, because you can feel the sense, you pick the objects. Usually there will be hundreds of objects, even thousands of objects on the shelves, and the clients can pick randomly whatever they want to pick and make this arrangement in the sandbox, right? This is one of them, but people also mobilize in China calligraphy therapy, flower arrangement therapy, etc. So the point is that people feel very comfortable. They feel they love to mobilize their 5 senses, not just words. I think that might be a very sort of a Western phenomenon, like talk therapy. We talk a lot, talk. But Chinese people, they always like to get up to do things, and they ask the therapist, what can I do when I get back, right? What can I do with my body? Exercise, running, meditation, something. So yeah, people love to do that. And then once you make that arrangement there, then you start a dialogue with the therapist. So the arrangement, the Sandplay arrangement is almost like a bridge sometimes, I think, between the therapist and the clients, of course, but also between words and one's inner landscape. This is like a little bridge to externalize your inner landscape, and that projected out onto this, and then you have a dialogue, because we don't pick things randomly. There's a reason why you pick this pine tree, not that, right? So that usually is the springboard for a much more productive conversation. Yeah.
If we have time, I'd just like to ask one quick additional question that comes from Alexandra Wagner, who asks about the sample of people you spoke to in your research. You mentioned police, psychotherapists. What range of people did you speak to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a big chunk, of course, of psychotherapists, I gradually realized I need to rely on them and I'm more willing to talk. And then the other big chunk are I call the clients or trainees, people who come to those workshops. So these people, they are very diverse. So they include school-age children, parents, a lot of time parents, and also police officers. I managed to speak to some of them. A couple of soldiers in the paramilitary hospitals, and at the training centers, then I encountered all kinds of people, because the people who go to the training centers, they don't really expect them to become a psychotherapist. Many of them hold a day job. They get this piece of a certificate just in case they want to practice, but also they want to use that learning as a self-help. So they don't really want to become a psychotherapist. Now, these people are diverse. I encountered, teachers, workers, and enterprise employees, private business owners, all kinds of people coming to those training centers. Yeah, so it's quite diverse.
Right. Well, I think it's just about time for us to close, but I just want to thank Professor Zhang for this really fascinating talk. And if anybody is like me, they're going to go out and take a look at the book, because I imagine there's a lot more in there that has barely even been touched upon. So I just want to thank everyone for being with us today. This webinar is going to be available for the next few days on our website, china.ucsd.edu. And please join us again for our upcoming public webinars, which you can see on the slide there on February 11th. There's one by Kaiping Chen of Wisconsin, When National Identity Meets Conspiracy, COVID-19 Conspiracies on Weibo. February 17th, there will be a talk about foundations for low carbon energy systems in China. And on February 24th, Dennis Simon of Duke is going to give a talk titled The Growing Role of Science, Technology, and Higher Education in China's Belt and Road Initiative. So thanks once again to Professor Zhang, and thanks to everybody for coming. Have a wonderful
afternoon. Thank you very much. Yeah, okay. Thanks so much. Some great questions. Yeah.
Yeah, we really just touched on the tip of the iceberg. There were,
I saw some questions in the chat, but anyway, that was delightful and great questions, and it was very interesting. But thank you so much for hosting, coordinating. It was really wonderful. Yeah.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's really wonderful to have the chance to at least see you in person on Zoom, and hopefully in the IRL, as the kids say, at some point in the near future. And thank you so much.
I hope so too. I hope to see you in person, maybe at AAS someday.
Hopefully sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Great, wonderful. Yeah. Stay in touch, and thank you, Sherry. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.